In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint Raptors Space Marines and go over a few tips, tricks and shortcuts you can apply when you're looking to paint an army quickly that still looks great on the tabletop. We'll paint a squad of 5 Marines in next to no time, so let's get on with it. The first thing I've done is primed the 5 Marines using Mechanicus Grey Spray Primer, and this is part of painting things fast, is to reduce the amount of time you have to spend painting with a brush and use things like airbrushes and cans as much as you can. Next up, I've sprayed the models with Deathguard Green from above and about 45 degrees, so the majority of the models are Deathguard Green. There's a little bit of Mechanicus Grey underneath. Now, it's probably not as dark as I want it to be, so if you want to spray black first, you can, but otherwise, let's get on to the next step. Next, I've sprayed the models with Tamiya Gloss Clear. Now, you can use whatever gloss varnish you want. I use this because I really quite like it, and it's in a can, so it's fairly quick in terms of getting it set up and spraying if you've got nice weather outside. We're going to apply some decals next. It just so happens that I've got a really old Forge World Raptors decal sheet, so we're going to be using that. You can see I've already used a few of them in past projects, which I can't even remember doing. In terms of how I like to get the decal off the decal paper, I like to pop it onto some kitchen roll, wet that up and then let it soak in until the decal is ready to move. I'll then place this onto the miniature. Now, because of the shape of the decals, they don't quite fit the shoulder pads, so I'm going to use a decal softener, and my favourite decal softener to use is Tamiya Mark Fit Strong. If you use something like Microsol, that's absolutely fine, but this is my preferred one. I'm going to pop it on, let it soak into the decal, take most of it away, and I'm probably going to need 2 or 3 applications of this to get those decals solid. And once the decals are completely dry, I'm going to just gloss over them again, ready for the next step. Next up, we're going to quickly shade the model, and this is why it's important we've got that gloss varnish on there, because it removes the surface tension. I'm going to take some Athonian Camoshade. I'm just going to slosh this onto the miniatures. I'm going to push it into those recesses. Now, we do want to keep an eye on this because we don't want it to pool too much in too many places. If it does, I'll show you how to fix that in the next step, but we just want to make sure it goes into all those recesses, all those nooks, those crannies, those gaps between the armor plates, and just wick any away that starts to pool. Once those models are dry, you may well find that even though you've watched it like a hawk, it is still pooled in some areas. It's a really easy fix. We're just going to mix some Athonian Camoshade in with some Deathguard Green paint. We're going to mix that nicely, and then we're going to just layer it into some of those areas. Now, Deathguard Green is fairly thin for a base paint, and of course when you thin it with a wash as well, it's going to get even thinner, so make sure you haven't got too much on your brush because you don't want to flood the area. And just build those layers up, and because it's so thin, you can get a nice transition as well. Now, the Raptors are a second founding chapter of the Raven Guard, which means they like their stealth, so we're going to go for a very muted theme with these models. The first thing we're going to do is paint all of the leather, any rubber parts, all those piping, the seams behind the armor joints, all that is going to be painted with black Templar contrast paint. Simple reason for that: when that dries, it's going to automatically give you a highlight. It's going to just get into those recesses and it's going to give you a really nice effect without having to worry about highlighting a lot of the areas. Now, there is the option to do it later on, which I will show you, but we just want to take our time here, make sure we don't spill it onto any of those areas that we've finished the green armor. When that's completely dry, we're going to paint all of the hard casings of things like the weapons, and the colour I'm going to use for this is German Grey from AK Interactive. Now, this covers really well, really nicely. It's essentially a very dark grey, so if you've got something like Eshin Grey from Citadel, that'll work absolutely fine as well. If you haven't got Eshin Grey, then you could try mixing Mechanicus and Abaddon Black, and that will give you, again, a really dark grey. And essentially we want that really dark, almost black grey, because we're going to shade it next, and that's going to give us the really nice effect and just a little hint of a slightly lighter colour than black on all of this casing. So we've got things like the weapon casing. We're going to cover off things like the aerials on the backpacks as well, and the vents on the back of the backpacks, because again, we're going for that really muted colour scheme. We don't want bright shiny silver. When that's dry, we'll wash it with Nuln Oil, and as this starts to dry, you'll really see a really fantastic effect coming out with nice transitions from that dark grey to black in those deepest recesses. So again, take your time with this and try not to get it over bits you've already finished, like the green armour. If you do, it's not the end of the world, because we will be going in and fixing it a little later on, but we just want to take our time with this, get everything covered, and then we'll come back and start to have a look at how we can do some really quick highlighting to sell the effect on these models. The first bit of highlight we're going to do is with Gorthor Brown, and we're going to do this on all of the leather and all of the leather straps, so things like the holster and obviously the straps around the legs. And essentially what we're doing is we're going to thin this down a little bit. We're going to make sure we've got hardly any on our brush. We've got a really good tip on there, and we're just going to tap this along the most raised and sharpest edges of the leather elements. Now we're not doing a full edge highlight by dragging it along, we're just doing little taps as we go, and what this will do is start to bring out a distressed leather effect. Now I know what you're thinking, oh, brown over on black, why did we not just use a brown colour? That's fine, we can do that, but I've decided to use black, so I just want it to be much darker, and because it's going over that green base coat, it actually steps up really nicely, and that Gorthor Brown really does enhance some of these edges. So we're just looking to get them all marked and scuffed like some old leather. So work your way along, and then we'll come back and start on the next section. Next, we'll highlight all of the hard casing on the weaponry, and the colour we're going to use for this is Dawnstone, and yet again we're going to use the same technique we used for highlighting the leather. So make sure you haven't got too much on a brush, make sure you've got a really good point, and we're just going to tap it along those sharpest edges. Now the sergeant here has got an Aquila on his gun, which we're going to highlight properly, but apart from that, the rest of it we're just going to tap the brush, and this again is going to add to that really distressed look. And this is essentially how we're going to paint from now on, in terms of how we're going to design the really distressed nature on the armor as well as the equipment to make it look like they've been in the field for a very long time. The next highlight is going to be with dark aluminium from Vallejo. Now if you haven't got dark aluminium, you can use lead belcher from Citadel, it'll work just fine. What we're looking to do again is tap along those areas where we've got some metallic elements, because if you can imagine, they've darkened these weapons down, and as they're fighting they might get scuffed and some of that metal shine might start to come through. So things like the vents on the backpack, things like the muzzle on the gun, etc., as well as some of the mechanical parts and the weapon clips. So just take your time, be selective with this, because again we don't want it too shiny. There are some silver elements on here, such as the purity seal on Sergeant and his blade, so we're just going to base those using the dark aluminium. We'll shade those two silver elements with Nuln Oil, so make sure you haven't got too much on your brush, because we don't want it to flood over into any bits we've already finished, but we do want it to really dull down the blade and that purity seal. So take your time with it, and if you want to put a second coat on, you can. I'm happy with just one in this instance. We'll then highlight that silver with a bright chrome highlight from Vallejo Model Air. Now any bright silver will do here, and I'm just looking to drag this along the edges just to give them a little bit of a pop. Now this will be the brightest part of the model, but we will dull everything down with a matte varnish right at the end, and that'll unify everything as well. Now some of your models may have purity seals, so we want to try and get these done fairly quickly. Now the first thing we're going to do is base coat them all with Rakarth Flesh. Now this can be touch and go, sometimes it's really thin, sometimes it's too thick, so it'll really depend on the paint pot that you've got, how long you've had it, how long it's been open, but you may well get away with one coat here. Once that's dry, take some Agrax Earthshade and shade the Rakarth Flesh. Now, one caveat here, you don't want to flood the Agrax Earthshade, particularly with the newer Agrax Earthshade, because it's a little bit glossier, and it really does come a lot heavier in terms of how it looks when it dries. It's a lot darker than the old one in those recesses. When that's totally dry, we'll highlight back up with Rakarth Flesh, and again we're just looking to catch the most raised areas, leaving that Agrax Earthshade in the recesses. Finally, we'll take some Pallid Wych Flesh, and we're just going to paint this over the most raised areas, catching those sharpest edges of the paperwork. And again, we don't want it to be too bright, because this is supposed to be fairly muted and fairly dull in terms of the overall scheme, so use it fairly sparingly. I wanted to add a marking on for the sergeant. Now the sergeant's helmet's normally black with a yellow stripe, and this guy's not got one, so I'd do that left knee pad. So the first thing I wanted to do was paint the yellow stripe. Now again, I don't want a really bright yellow stripe, so I just took some Baal Brown and sketched in a rough line. I painted the rest of the knee using that German grey, and then I went back in with some Zamizi Desert to highlight just the top half of that line. Now any mistakes I make here I can always go back over and fix with the German grey, but essentially this is a nice muted yellow colour that really fits the aesthetic of a Raptors Sergeant, and it's a nice compromise I think when you haven't got the helmet on the model. We're motoring along really nicely, so it's time to distress some of those decals, add some chips and scratches on them, and that's really easy and straightforward using some Deathguard Green. So all we're looking to do is just dot this over the decals, pull it in nice sharp motions to simulate scratches, and don't forget the tactical decals on the other side as well. And while I've got the Deathguard Green, I'm also going to stipple it around that Sergeant's knee pad to give the impression of wear and tear. The first highlight we'll do on the armour is going to be with Krieg Khaki, which is a really bright yellowy green, and we want to thin this down, and again, like we've done all the rest of the weathering, have very little on our brush. And what we're looking to do is identify those areas which are going to get the most chipping really, and we're going to tap our brush along them, and we're going to do it like a little edge highlight but in a very jagged manner. And some areas we're going to have a little bit more wear and tear, such as where you've got the knee pad going over the shin and the thigh plate, for example. There's going to be quite a lot of wear and tear there, so we're going to focus on those areas and really build it up. And in some areas we're going to do little sharp dashes and notches, because that's going to simulate where armour's just been scratched. That armour's looking pretty distressed at the moment, so there's just one more step to go in terms of getting that finished. And what we'll do is go back to that German grey, so it's a very, very dark grey. Now, sometimes you can use Skaven Blight Dinge, but it's a little bit too warm for this. We want something much darker to really contrast the armour. And where we've got a build-up of Krieg Khaki and lots of chunky bits of Krieg Khaki, we want to just tap in some of this German grey, and this is going to simulate the ceramite underneath the layers of paint that's been worn away through battle attrition and through sort of nicks from whether it's bolter rounds or whether it's just rocks and things like that, scratching it as the Space Marine goes. So we want to use this fairly sparingly though. We don't want to lump this on, because otherwise we'll just end up with a grey mess. We want the armour to read green, and then on closer inspection to really see those little nicks and dinks. One of the last things we need to do is all of the lenses. So the first thing I want to do is paint all of the lenses white. Now there's a few lenses across the squad, and there's also some lights on the armour. There's some screens and things we want to do as well. So I'm using bold titanium white from Procryl. Use whatever white you are comfortable with. The only thing I would say is don't use AK white, because it doesn't play well with contrast paints in my experience, but bold titanium white, white scar should be perfectly fine. I'll then work my way through some contrast paints for the lenses. Now for all the green lenses and the green screens, I'm using Karandras Green, which is a nice bright green contrast paint. So just pop this on there, it'll work into those recesses and leave you a little bit of a highlight. For all the red lenses, I'm using Baal Red exactly the same way as I use Karandras Green. Going over that white base coat, it gives you a really nice bright red, and it really contrasts having these like bright green and red lenses against the really muted and drab colour scheme. It reminds you a little bit of Splinter Cell. For those Marines with helmets on, we need to do the eye lenses, so all I've done is painted them white, and I'm then going to use Ironjawz Yellow, which is not a bright yellow, it's kind of a murky yellow colour, but really fits the lens build perfectly, in particular in the case of the Raptors. We're just going to paint it on there, and as it seeps into that recess a little bit, you get a little bit of a simulated glow as well. I've given the models a coat of matte varnish. I really think they've come out great. I'm really happy with how they look, and it could possibly be the starting of another army for me. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Now I'm sure you want to paint the Raven Guard-esque face on the miniature, so check out this video here I did quite a while ago on how to paint Raven Guard skin. I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, let me know, leave a like and a comment down below. I'll see you next time.